I have one.
Okay.
Layla needs a quart soda.
I got water.
Okay.
Maybe, yeah.
But my husband might be coming.
Okay.
You'll let him not on the list. Okay. But I don't know what time he's gonna be like.
That's okay.
Okay.
We'll let him in.
Okay.
He just has to say he's got the internet. Everybody put your thumbs up. Vibrate. 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 I can hear you. Okay, perfect. I will do a brief introduction for you before.
Okay, wonderful.
You may wish to sit off to the side, maybe because we have a limited amount of camera space. Typically my boyfriend comes and does all the video for us, but he had to do a work trip.
Okay.
That's why I'm just anxiously floating around the technology. Okay. Yeah, okay. As one does. It's all set up. It's all good. Technology is not my strong suit. Design a website? It's true. Layla's very good. But mostly her job is to sit there and create to radiate confidence. I'm gonna give it like 2-3 minutes and then I'll start.
Oh, right.
About this, I heard you. He lives in the building next door, and he'd be like, it's very much all these kinds of captures. I guess anything, so. I love that. You guys hear last night. Tell me about him. They usually read and they really well. Do we know each other? Yeah, somewhere. Yeah, that's exactly.
We went to, I don't know if you the NPR.
Or over there.
We went to a live meeting of Wayward. I don't know if you're on TikTok and all, but this guy. So I'm not gonna answer like,
I don't look at our coach.
but it's not like a freaking
Yeah.
genius. Like, such genius.
Nobody else.
Yeah.
Church, man.
Yes.
I need to learn. Like, I clearly have gone and picked up.
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, all right.
That was hard with the job.
Oh, these things are
It's over. Thanks for remembering.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for being here. If you want to go ahead and find your seat, if you already have a beverage, much appreciated. Now's the time to settle in, settle down. We'll get started here in just a few moments. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'm going to stall for a tiny bit of time as we wait for the remainder of people to grab their seats and grab their beverages. And for those of you tuning in online, hello, welcome. We appreciate all our guests, virtual and otherwise. I feel like we need like cozier lighting. Hold on. Ready for this? Ooh.
Cozy lighting.
All right, lighting's now cozier. Now, I just like to do a quick survey of the audience. You could chime in with an internet comment, or you could raise your hand. How many of you is this your first ever time attending a Chicago for Chicagoans lecture? Welcome, welcome newbies. We're nice people. Thank you for being here.
I know, yeah, literally.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Thanks to everyone here for being vaccinated. Getting vaccinated is incredibly important. So if you haven't yet gotten vaccinated against COVID-19, please do so. We have had a lot of questions in the last few weeks about our masking requirement and vaccine requirements for the safety and, most importantly, comfort for all of us as we progress into the next phase of this disease. We will be still requiring both vaccinations and appropriate mask wearing for the duration of our lecture series. So thank you guys for understanding that we are a small nonprofit who can't afford to have a bunch of fancy lawyers to defend us in a lawsuit, and for being here and being vaccinated and being safe. So thank you guys so much.
No, thank you.
For those of you who may not know who I am, my name is Patty Swanson. I started Chicago for Chicagoans almost 6 years ago. We had a huge birthday party last year for a 5-year anniversary. Just kidding. No, we didn't. I don't know if you guys noticed, there's like a pandemic for the last couple of years. So normally we are an organization that gives walking tours in the summer and does lectures inside in the winter where it's nice and warm. We haven't done walking tours in a couple of years, but I am excited to say we will be bringing walking tours back this summer, which is very exciting. Yeah. And we'll be doing scavenger hunts as well. So if you want something a little bit smaller and you want to be able to do something more at a self-guided pace, you'll also have an option. So we're trying our best to cater to everyone and create lots of ways for you guys to engage. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are entirely women-led. It is Women's History Month, after all. Our entire organization is run by women, and all of us are volunteers. So thank you guys. For spending your time here and letting us put all of these unpaid hours to use, helping you guys learn more about the history of your city, and hopefully you go home and tell all the things you learn here to all of your friends and neighbors, greatly expanding our reach. Since day one, we've been a pay-what-you-can based programming organization, which means if you have a little extra scratch you don't mind throwing our way, that's a tax-deductible donation. You can give us money via cash, Venmo, Square. We accept checks, firstborn babies, all of the normal currencies. So please, if you have a little extra money, that goes directly to pay our speakers and to cover our operating expenses. We really appreciate it. We are over 90, probably 8% funded by your donations. So we really do appreciate it. I think I've almost finished stalling for time. But without further ado, speaking of walking tours, I'm very excited to present tonight's speaker. She first started working with our organization as a Chinatown tour guide, born and raised in Chinatown. Debbie Liu is our speaker tonight. She's going to be talking about redistricting and wards in Chicago, which, how many of you guys feel like you know a lot about this topic? Yeah. I am also not raising my hand. So we're all about to get an education on something that affects all of us. What ward you're in depends on, your alderman. It's the one who oversees your ward, and your alderman is the person you complain to if you've got too many potholes, or you need a stop sign installed, or, any number of things, or if you want more affordable housing in your neighborhood. So aldermen have a lot of power in Chicago. Your ward is really important. And Debbie's going to tell us all about it. So without further ado, give it up for her.
Hello, thank you. Like Patty said, I'm Debbie. I am born and raised in Chicago. My family still is in Chinatown. I live not too far in South Loop. But I don't think you want my firstborn child. So I do have a 10-month-old. I'm trying to figure out how to. Ooh, this might be too low. I do have a 10-month-old, and they're texting me that he's a-okay for tonight. For now. So my day job, I work at Metropolitan Planning Council, which is a local urban planning policy change organization for the Chicagoland region. So I do work with data quite a bit for my work, but also I have been a former commissioner for the Chicago Advisory Redistricting Commission, which was formed last summer by Change Illinois, which is a good governance nonprofit local to Chicago. So during that time, at the summer of last year, we started as a 13-member commission, an independent commission to the city's process. Traditionally, the city's process is very closed door. There's really no open or transparent process that happens. What happens usually is that the mayor leads closed door meetings with aldermen, and then everyone just kind of takes a little slice of their ward or their district, and everyone kind of puts their ideas together and makes a map. So usually what happens is people who are running against each other or are against each other during city council, they use these opportunities to like kind of draw them out of their wards or draw them out of the districts that they want to run in. So it is a very contested process. So what we were trying to do as the Chicago Advisory Redistricting Commission is to just completely take out the politics of it and actually ask residents, everyday residents, how they wanted their wards to be drawn. And it was a multi-month process. We heard from many Chicagoans who really care about the issue but don't really know how to influence the process. And what they told us is like, this is how I feel my ward is. This is my community. This is my neighborhood. And we took all of that oral and written testimony and crafted our own map, independent of what the city did. At the same time, City Hall and the aldermen, the 50 aldermen, were crafting their own map and hit some snags along the way because they're supposed to get 41 aldermen to sign on to a map so that it passes City Hall, council. So they really could spike like 9 aldermen and then get 41 to sign on and then pass that map, which they've done traditionally. Which is really interesting in this census, which only happens every 10 years. So the last one happened in 2020. 2020 was a very interesting year, as we all know. So it was under President Trump's presidency, and there were folks who were saying that evidence of undermining certain populations during the census count. So that meant not allocating resources or money to certain populations, maybe the homeless population, maybe minority populations in cities and towns. And that actually gave certain neighborhoods or a certain population an advantage. So if you get counted or you don't get counted, you are more able to get resources for your community, whatever your community is. And because of that undermining of the election, undermining the redistricting process through the census count, there was also COVID. It was the height of COVID, and people were not interested in talking to other people. So if you did not respond to the census people would actually knock on your door. And that was not the same as it was in previous censuses. So because of that, we were expecting an undercount. We were expecting an undercount on so many fronts. Fortunately, it was not as severe as we thought it would be, but it was still an undercount. The other thing that was different in 2020 is the census was online for the first time. So because of that, there were certain populations that were just missed because maybe they don't have access to internet or computers or technology. So there were a lot of challenges for the 2020 census. So what I wanted to kind of go back to is that even though this is a process that happens every 10 years, we are always underprepared for it. And it goes back to our like way back history. So the first census was done in 1790 under Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. And the last one was in April of 2020. But there's this like process that happens that is actually very contentious because there's a strategy that happens every year that like tries to maximize certain populations that can't count it and minimize certain populations that should be counted. And it actually dates back to quite part of our history, which is like the 3/5 clause. So for purposes of representation in Congress, enslaved black folks in a state would be counted as 3/5 of a person or 3/5 of the number of white inhabitants of that same state. So that is exactly why we are always in this cycle of trying to catch up. So like all that to say, things are the way they are because we have this racist history of doing things the way that we have been. So for me, why this issue is so important to me is, so I grew up in Chinatown, and Chinatown has always been represented by multiple people. In the city, in the state, mostly because the business district and where residents live are in kind of two separate boundaries, which is deliberate actually. So the history of Chinatown, for example, in Chicago is initially it was formed around Clark and Van Buren, which is now downtown, which is kind of across the street from the prison. And it moved like 110 years ago, and moved to like Clark to Cermak and Wentworth, and which is what people know as Chinatown today, and it's been there for like 110 years. So throughout that history, it's been represented actually by many corrupt people, including two people who one has been convicted recently, so we all know. So Chinatown actually has this like really corrupt history, and what's really interesting is when people say Chinatown has grown, it actually has grown, and the population actually has gone beyond Armour Square, and it's gone to Bridgeport, McKinley Park, Brighton Park, even Bronzeville and Pilsen and South Loop, to kind of like all directions. And because of the migration patterns that have changed over the years, residents have never really felt like they were represented, because they were represented either in the residential part or too much or too little, and then there was also some being represented in the business part, which is where people think of Chinatown traditionally, in Armour Square. And part because there's physical boundaries that have been built around Chinatown, so you can think of highways, you can think of CTA Metro, different physical boundaries like the Chicago River even, and they're all kind of built as infrastructure to limit and to enclose certain populations. So when the highways were built in the 60s, actually eminent domain took a lot of Chinatown, and there was like a Hardin Square Park, which was like a field house in Chinatown, that was taken away to be built, to actually be land to be built for the highways. And so Chinatown actually lost its only field house and park, and then spent decades fighting for Kingtown Park. If you've been there, it's amazing, but it also meant that at least a generation didn't have access to a park or a field house, which is kind of crazy to think about. So nonetheless, a lot of people often say, you know, that's great. You have like 3 elected officials, or you have 3 people who are representing you in city council, or at the state. But that's actually not true, because when you're such a small population of an entire district or entire ward, you're more likely to be overlooked. And it actually is overlooked. There's so many problems that actually happen in Chinatown that just have never been resolved. A good example is actually the lack of a high school in Chinatown. There's never been a high school located physically in Chinatown. And so students actually have to go across the city to get high school education. There is a school that's known to what we know as Chinatown. However, it's still quite a distance away, even if you were to drive or take public transportation. So there are some physical limitations when we think about like what makes a neighborhood and why do some neighborhoods get some resources and others don't. Like on the north side, your high school is, you can walk there, which is not the case in a lot of south side neighborhoods. So I think that sometimes we need to think about how representation is actually paired with access to resources in a community and not just like fixing potholes. So that's important. Let's see. I wrote some notes down so that I can make sure I remember them. Wrote them all down like a couple hours ago. So
It lives in your brain.
it does. Let's see. Oh, okay. So when I was a commissioner on the Chicago Advisory Redistricting Commission, we were trying to draw lines that were free of like gerrymandering. So what if you do know gerrymandering or you don't know gerrymandering? So this is an example of how gerrymandering works. So you can have 50 precincts and have 60% blue and 40% red, and this is not related to political affiliations. This is just like colors. So 60% blue and 40% red. You can draw it evenly, like this, and have blue be predominant. But you can also draw it in other ways, where red becomes dominant, even if it's only 40%. And so this is an example of how actually redistricting actually happens. And this is not just redistricting at the city level, this is redistricting at the congressional level, at the state level. Everyone kind of draws ways to benefit the incumbent or the people who are actually drawing the lines. So it's elected and appointed officials that actually draw these lines. And it's particularly contentious in Chicago because we are a hyper-segregated city. So the way we draw our lines then dictate how our neighborhoods become even more segregated or physically limit the growth of any resident in Chicago. So what's interesting is when we're looking at this map, actually, we actually have two maps that are up for referendum. The map that we were drawing did not actually get the 10 aldermanic support to actually pass it to referendum. So this is like the whole process. So if we had gotten 10, then we would, at least 10, we would make it to the public referendum that's going in June of this year, which is the primary gubernatorial election, June 28th. And even though we didn't get the 10 aldermen, there was the Latino caucus that actually got 11 aldermen, I think now 15 aldermen. And so their map has been submitted to the referendum question. The other map is the Black Caucus map, which is the Rules Committee map. So that's an official city map that is coming out of the Rules Committee. So because they don't have 41 aldermen to support that specific map, any other alderman that has at least 10 supporting aldermen can submit another map up for referendum. And they have until basically May to make negotiations settled, which doesn't look like it at this point. The Latino caucus back map, which people call the coalition map. That's their actually official name. Actually joined forces with the Chicago Advisory Redistricting Commission after we realized we're not going to be able to get 10 alders. It's very political why that did not happen. And so now there's two maps that are up for referendum. The People's Coalition map is now the new coalition map. And that one has 16 majority black wards and 15 majority Latino wards. Even though the Latino wards, or the Latino population has dramatically risen, while the black population has dramatically decreased over the past 10 years. So what's at stake is actually huge for both the Latino caucus and the black caucus. So the Latino, that was a Latino caucus map. The black caucus map, or the Rules Committee map, has 14 majority Hispanic wards, which is one less than the other, and then preserves 17 African American wards with an additional black plurality ward, which is something which means that they're keeping their 18 black wards that they have right now, despite dramatic population loss. So at the same time, when Latino population has risen, they could potentially get up to 16 wards, but because the black and Latino population tend to live in proximity to each other, the way to draw it is super, super contentious. It gets down to the alley. So, like, there is a lot at stake for the black caucus and the Latino caucus, because one less person could mean that there's less power for their specific agenda. And, I think what's interesting is both of the maps have a majority Asian, for the first time, majority Asian ward in Chicago, centered around Chinatown. So there is momentum to think about what is a community and why it deserves representation in the way that it should actually be drawn. But I think also there's a lot of sentiments about what things should be and what things, despite maybe not representation that always looks the way that it should look, people feel really strongly that because, like, for example, the South Side should be represented by black aldermen because it is majority black, even though it has dramatically decreased in population. So there's a lot of focus around that, and folks just haven't been able to come to an agreement about what that should look like, which is actually really interesting. So there's a UIC professor who actually looks at redistricting. His name is Professor Vargas. And he specifically has been looking at the correlation between crime, violent crime, and ward and redistricting. So if we look at wards that have not changed much during redistricting, such as Edison Park or Bridgeport or Lakeview, they have basically never changed. And so it benefits the incumbent, but also it keeps those districts relatively safe. And because of that, that means other parts of the city is getting redistricted, which is Inglewood, which is East Garfield Park, Austin. So those are the same communities that make the news for violent crimes. But they get sliced and diced in every form, every redistricting opportunity. So when there's no consolidated resource or like policing or strategy, the issue then becomes the community or the members that are the issue. And it's really far from it. If we like actually adequately supplied the resources for education, for community policing, for libraries, community centers, will we be seeing the same issues that we are seeing in other communities? And we're not sure. So we definitely wanted to bring light to some of the issues when folks kind of say, these communities are byproducts of things that are happening to them as people and not necessarily them as community members or them as neighborhoods. So like I definitely think that there is so much potential to really rethink how redistricting happens for the city and for kind of the state really overall. If we just keep replicating the process of like elected officials deciding who should be in their ward as voters, we're going to continue having these problems. So that's really, I think, all I had for my part tonight.
Amazing.
Guess I'm open to questions.
Questions. Yes.
How many wards are there in the city of Chicago? It's a bad question for a Chicagoan to ask.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, so the question was how many wards Chicago has. We have 50 wards, and that's outlined in our state legislature. So we cannot have less and we cannot have more. But coincidentally, we actually have a lot. So I think New York is one of the biggest, I think actually the biggest city, and they have 53. Los Angeles is number 2, I think, but they have like 25. So we actually probably don't need many elected officials at the city level. But that is outlined in our law.
So you talked about the two coalition maps, the Latino and the Black coalition maps. So how do wards like the 19th ward, where I live, which is on the south side, but it is still predominantly white, and Lakeview and other neighborhoods, how are those types of neighborhoods affected by redistricting, or they're not affected?
I'll try to summarize.
Okay, so how are predominantly white wards affected by redistricting?
Right, if at all.
So I think that's the thing. The Latino and the Black Caucus want to basically minimize white wards, predominantly white wards. However, you can only draw from so many white wards because they're not always immediately adjacent to other minority wards, which make it very difficult to actually draw. So actually map drawing is a very tedious and quite honestly annoying process because you have to draw, there are legal restrictions, like you have to draw each ward to be like approximately 54,000 people. Yeah. And at least for Chicago based on our population. Then you also have to take into account the Voting Rights Act, which is something that's at the federal level, where you have to basically give minority representation where there is an opportunity for that. How that gets interpreted is up to legal battles after the map is drawn. So basically, if there is sufficient population to warrant an Asian ward, for example, then you have to draw it that way. Otherwise, you're diluting the voting population and the voting power. And this applies to every map that gets drawn. I think so. The 19th ward is actually, so that's Beverly Morgan Park, right? Yeah. So there's a significant white population there. There's also, it's adjacent to a significant Black population as well. So how that gets drawn typically is like by the density of the white population just opposed to the density of the Black population. So it could be drawn as a predominantly Black ward, or it could be drawn as a predominantly white ward. And we actually were debating ourselves on how to draw it, because I think if you slice it vertically versus you slice it horizontally, it will become very different. But I think ultimately you have to draw it as a Black ward or a Latino ward, because I think immediately adjacent to that is a very significant Latinx population. So how the ultimate question is not how it affects white wards, but how it affects Black versus Latino. So because that's an area where it's contested because you can draw it Latino or you can draw it black, depending on how you slice it, and that would mean that one would get more and one would get less. And I think ultimately that is what is kind of at the heart of this debate is if one gets more and one gets less, the other will challenge in court, and that would mean that anything could happen. So, like, I think it's very dramatic how it's going to play out.
So Tim O'Shea might be out of his job.
Possibly. There could be a lot of people that could be losing their jobs soon.
We have an internet question I'm going to ask.
Okay.
You cited the professor who found correlation between crime and ward stability. Is that causative? What influence do older people have on crime reporting and prevention?
So there is a correlation. I do not think that's a causation. But again, I'm not the professor, so I'm not the person to answer that question. But
Who's the professor's name again?
Robert Vargas, Vargas. He's a sociologist, sociology professor. I'm sorry, I need to repeat the question. What was the second part of the question?
What influence do older people have on crime reporting and prevention?
So what influence the alderman has on crime reporting and prevention? So a lot of it stems through Chicago Police Department, the Chicago Police Department. How they report actually varies from time to time. And I think part of it is funding. That's why a huge debate is happening right now about like CPD funding and how it actually should be funded, how it can actually be carried out. I think our immediate notion is always to like fund more, and then maybe the crime will go away. However, we actually haven't really. That's not really a tested thought. But I mean, anytime you throw money at something, you hope that that's going to fix your problem. So, I mean, I do that to my kid all the time. Like, take some toys or something. But like, that doesn't necessarily always correlate. Like, I think that's kind of one part of the issue is, the alderman has a lot of say in how these departments get funded, and Chicago Police Department is one of those agencies. Even though they also get federal funding. And I guess the reporting part is largely through CPD. The prevention part has a lot to do with the alderman. They could do alternative, so CAPS is the Chicago Alternative Policing, which allows kind of like neighborhood residents to kind of do more black clubs and do more like other types of policing that isn't necessarily always locking people up in jail. So like that could be funded through some of the aldermanic menu money. So each alderman has money to do other things to help the ward that doesn't necessarily have to be tied up to the city budget. What happens every year around the fall is a city budget that gets passed. So each alderman gets a vote on like a package that the mayor proposes, and this is around like October. So usually this follows like state allocations, and like so then you have a general understanding of how much money is going to come in, and then how you allocate it is dependent on like what is meaningful and what the elected official wants to carry for that year. A lot of it is tied to elections. So the next election is next year. So there is a lot of you'll actually see a lot of this this year when the budget comes out, and you'll get to see what how they're trying to sway voters. So and some of it is already starting right now. So you can see what's happening in the news where people are trying to message a certain tactic or a certain program that they're interested in, so that hopefully it can garner votes by next year. And that election is in March or February of next year, so there's a lot at stake.
Sweet. Other questions? Yeah.
Oh gosh, okay. Maybe
Pick
Patty,
any
you call.
question you like. Okay.
We're all
We'll start with the first one I saw, which was
Yeah.
here in front.
So, did you say people were asked what they thought the redistricting should look like, and then they described verbally what that would be? Like, there seems like there might be some subjectivity to that or interpretation involved. And why was that request even made?
Yeah, so the Chicago Advisory Redistricting Commission. Oh, sorry. The question is how the oral testimonies that were provided during the time of summer of last year during the Chicago Advisory Redistricting Commission. So we as a commission solicited feedback from the community. So people were telling us how their wards should be drawn based on how their neighborhoods felt, like what their neighborhoods felt like to them. So we asked that, and hundreds of people responded, and people told us how their neighborhoods should look like. That's actually that should be the process to dictate redistricting. What happens in reality is that the city council gets together and says, "Hey, this is a ward that I want. This is a senior building that I want. This is a whatever park that I want," and then they just draw the map, and then that's the end of the day. So like there is no transparency, there is no accountability to that. So they get to choose their voters to essentially keep them in office for another 4 years. And that should not be the process. That's not transparent, that's not accountable, just none of those things. And if we believe in values that should strengthen our democracy, it should be based on the people and not the other way around.
I like that answer. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, so I had a question. I know earlier you were talking about Chinatown, and so and I find it very interesting because Chinatown has grown so much around what we consider, sort of traditional Chinatown. So how, what would be sort of the bottom line for Chinatown to, become an Asian ward?
Well, so the question is how can Chinatown become its own Asian ward? So currently the two maps that are on the table both have majority Asian wards, so I think that's a check. People do recognize that this is an important issue. I think it's been in the news enough for people to recognize that this is important. But also it's also legal because it's for the Voting Rights Act, you have to draw a ward where it is possible, and so there is very likely a Asian ward that comes out of this redistricting process.
You, sir.
So I'm in Uptown, which has a relatively high homeless population, and I guess my question is, to what extent, if it is even possible, do you take into consideration homeless populations and other vulnerable communities?
Yeah. So the question is how does the census take in homeless population and how do you count them? So the census deems the homeless population as a hard to count community, and so they devote extra resources to ensure that these communities get counted. Generally, it's neighborhood. Oh gosh. Okay, so the people who count. So what are they called?
Census
It's enumerators. There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
They go out in the community and they're actually hired through the Census Bureau. So they go out to the community and they, if there is a list, basically they get a list at some point to reach certain people who have not responded to the survey, to the census questionnaire. And so they have to go down the list. But then when they're knocking on each home, they actually are also serving the community where they see a homeless population. They actually are supposed to talk to them and like figure out where they actually live. So then they get assigned a approximate street address. So then there's a general understanding of like, then they talk to each other about like how many people actually live in a certain encampment. That is the process that I'm aware of. It is not obviously not the best process, but it gets more down down to the ground level than just estimating like, oh, we think that there's 100 population here or something like that. But it is a very hard to count community. The homeless population is definitely very hard, and they're transient, so they could be moving from one place to another overnight. So it is definitely a challenge.
Okay, hi. So I'm thinking about, you were talking about how the stable wards tend to have less crime, and you didn't really go into too much detail. I'm guessing that you would kind of make the argument that the wards that are being redistricted, it's hard for them to collaborate, say, about certain projects that might be helpful for crime reduction or violence prevention, because things are always changing. So I was just wondering if you could go into that a little bit.
Sure. The question is how, what happens to wards that get redistricting often versus wards that are less often. So some of the research that Professor Vargas has done. So there's actually a number of things that are happening without going into the whole history of Chicago politics and how the machine works in Chicago, even dating back to the dailies. So the brief history is the elected official makes sure that crime is reduced through hard policing, but also through things that are just like totally irrelevant. So they make sure that your potholes are patched, they make sure that your garbage is picked up, they make sure your lights on, they make sure that the things that you physically care about and you see and you like, that changes your sense of security and safety in your neighborhood, those get like fixed immediately. Because they have like superintendents that they can just call up at the different levels of government, and then they just kind of fix those things. So that's why that's how certain things get done in the city, and have been done for years. The thing to note is policing policing in general, not like policing where you just put handcuffs on people. Policing in general really requires many different types of strategies. So you want to make sure that kids are in school. You want to make sure that kids have access to libraries, to parks and other services that is beyond their school day, so that they actually have things to do and are occupied with their time. So they don't have to resort to other things that could be enticing, such as crime. However, when your elected official does not really care about schools or does not really care about like social services or like other things, then you reallocate all those money to policing, or you reallocate all that money to something different, and then wonder how policing kind of gets like how crime gets so violent, because you're not really thinking about comprehensive strategy, a holistic strategy on how to actually reduce crime overall, but you're actually looking at like so if you're thinking about your own community, what makes you feel safe? What makes you want to patronize your local businesses? What makes you want to go out? Is there a like liveliness? Is there like other neighbors that you trust? And those things don't actually happen in every neighborhood. And as unfortunate as it is, we're like when I move into my community, I look at like schools and access to parks and things that I feel like would make a community great, so that I'm able to meet my neighbors and like have conversations with them and catch up with people over coffee, right? But that's not actually the case in a lot of other neighborhoods. And because of that, I think that's where, like, if you don't have those infrastructure in place, you're more likely to get redistricted because people are like more likely to do other things with the money that could have been spent on all the other things that weren't spent on. So that is my long version of we need to have better elected officials.
Any other
Did you
questions?
say we need, what did you say about federal?
Oh, better elected
Better
officials.
elected officials.
Oh, better elected officials, oh, okay.
Stephanie.
How does the presence of large primarily white institutions such as U Chicago and Loyola affect the shape of wards in those areas? Are they like something you want in your ward? Do they get split up?
So
The question.
the question is, how do predominantly white institutions like U Chicago and Loyola influence the redistricting process? So it's not just race, it's also students. So the student population is actually something that's legally looked at the same way as like prisons. So there's like definitions of how census get counted. So students is part of it. So part of it is not just the age and the student population, but also like what people consider part of like a school campus. So what you don't want to do is generally you don't want to like split a campus apart for many different reasons. But usually the student population is not just limited to the campus location. So you have to draw lines that kind of like make sense in an area. But then once you're kind of at the fringe part, then you're more likely to kind of change how that might look. However, the uniqueness of student buildings and student living is that they're usually tall buildings, and so you have to like capture the entire building. You can't just like cut it in half and then just say like half of it's like in a different ward. So you can't do that. So like it's hard. You almost have to legally do it because the way that campuses are shaped and how buildings are formed. So there's like almost these natural boundaries on student campuses that make it more or less likely to be changed. However, the student population could be changed. It's just geographically, it's kind of bounded by certain limitations.
Yes, you other person in the back, I can't see. Yes.
So, in cases where new wards will be formed, how do people decide that, oh, I should run for alderman in this ward?
Ooh. Okay, so when wards are formed or not formed, how do you run for office?
Means in the sense that what goes on in a certain person's mind, you know, like this, I can
Debbie's
win.
not a mind reader, Sid.
Okay, so
I would vote for Patty as my alderman.
Aww.
No, guys, I'm staying out of politics. Hell no.
Okay, all I can say is anybody who is a U.S. citizen over the age of 18 can run for office,
So
and
do
you
it.
should.
Yeah.
You should. But you have to live in your whatever district that you're running in for at least a year. But redistricting changes that, so you can actually move. You have a year to move, so choose your wards carefully. But nonetheless, I think if you're interested, if you're civically minded, you care about issues, you should run for office. And I think more people need to run for office because then it's signaling to the incumbents that the only people that can run are the incumbents themselves, and that is not true. Yes.
So what happens if a ward gets changed from Latino to black? Does it actually sway the election process? So if it goes from black to Latino, does a Latino candidate have a better chance of winning? I mean, does that actually happen?
So the question is, if a ward changes from a predominantly Latino or a predominantly black ward to a different predominantly black or predominantly Latino ward, does that actually change anything? I think that's the heart of the question. Like that we don't necessarily have to think so. However, the way politics is played is if you're running in a predominantly Latino ward, you're almost expecting a predominant or a Latino person to represent you. And so it does potentially sway elections in that way. However, I don't even know if there's empirical evidence that actually shows that. I think people generally want to feel like they're being represented, even if the person that is up for election is like does not have the same values. So I think that's something that, you know, again, if you're interested in running, you should run. Because only because you have somebody representing you does not necessarily mean you have the same values as a person.
We'll take maybe like 3 more questions. I made that up arbitrarily. Yes, Stephanie.
How do places of incarceration, such as prisons and jails, affect the census, and how do they affect the redistricting process?
Yes. So how does the incarceration system affect redistricting and the census? So the Census Bureau has special counting mechanisms for colleges and for prisons. Prisons currently for the state of Illinois is counted by where the prison location is and not necessarily where the prisoners live for their like for when they're not in prison. So that will be changed actually for Illinois for the next census. So the argument is they are currently living in a certain place, which is aka the prison if they are in prison. And so they should be counted there. However, that means that the resources that would have been in like a different neighborhood would not have been going there. It would have gone to the area where the prison is located, which then actually has a lot of other social issues that come with it. But
prisoners can't vote.
Yes, prisoners cannot vote. So that is another like wrench to throw in because that is another thing, like people who cannot vote who are also non-citizens, for example, there's another way to like try to like limit their influence on redistricting, which should not be the case because it should be counting every single person, not just counting voting age or people who have been disqualified to vote. So there's many tactics that people try to use to draw people in or out of the process. So redistricting is complicated. Prison system is also complicated. So I think it's changing for the better come next census. But hopefully we did a good thing, or we did our best for this census and redistricting process.
How is it changing? You're saying it's changing for
Yes.
the better?
So the current system is if you are like in prison and it's currently in like a certain like a neighborhood, like there's a prison in Little Village, for example. Currently, the census says that if you're headquartered in the prison, you are counted as a resident of the prison and not counted as a resident of whatever neighborhood you were living prior to going to prison. So that means that the neighborhood that you would have been living in gets less resources because you're not counted there, you're counted somewhere else. So the politics of like where prisons get drawn actually itself is very political. So generally people don't actually want a prison in their ward, but it actually increases the population a lot. And so then there's like some pros and cons, quote unquote, of drawing wards with and without it. Yeah, so that is the short answer.
Point of information, the prison in Little Village is actually not in the ward.
Yes. Yes.
Of Little Village.
Yes, because people don't want.
Yes.
Yes, the prison that's technically in Little Village is actually in the North Lawndale ward.
How do the ICE facilities count?
Okay, we need order here. You still have to raise your hand. And
This
some
is
of
like
you
redistricting.
some of you have asked enough questions. So if you haven't asked a question, you get our final two. Yes, ma'am, you in the green.
I was curious, like, you bring up Little Village as, like, and Chinatown, and, like, how, we have 70 community areas in Chicago, right, but we only have 50 wards.
Yes.
So, like, ideally, to you, like, what would be the way to, how would those two definitions interact?
Yes.
Like, how do community areas versus wards
Yes.
come together?
You stole my question, Jamie.
How do the 77 community areas interact with the 50 wards? Currently, the current process is zero. The process that we actually try to do for the Chicago Advisory Redistricting Commission is actually, that's why we went back to the communities. Sometimes largely people actually consider their neighborhoods to be the community area and not so much the wards. Like the wards are these kind of artificially drawn lines that then dictate kind of like where their representation is and like what type of resources go there. But when we do ask like people, everyday people, how their communities look like, a majority of people actually pointed to their community area. However, usually community areas actually are bigger in terms of size, so it sometimes well exceeds the 54,000 that roughly makes a ward. So you have to then kind of draw some wards that kind of then become adjacent to like other wards that are similar in feature or like similar in race, similar by other factors. So an example could be like Lakeview Lincoln Park. So then it becomes kind of like drawn in ways where there's similar characteristics and not so much like this is Lakeview and this is like something else. So the 77 community areas actually were also drawn very arbitrarily. So it is very hard to kind of correlate some of that. So that's why we really went back to the communities or members of the public, like what is your community? And if it is community areas, then it is community areas. If it's something else, like Chinatown, where it's like grown way past multiple community areas, then that is another community. And so how are we looking at what people actually consider as a community to be drawn in such a way that actually reflects that?
Okay, we have time for one more question.
I can try my alternate.
Okay, do it.
What would be an alternative or an ideal way to represent a community in your mind?
So what is an ideal way to represent a community in my mind?
Or even an alternative. It doesn't have to be ideal.
So, I mean, we tried to do that with the Chicago Advisory Redistricting Commission. It's also the first time any independent organization tried to do any redistricting for the city.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to think about. But basically, so Change Illinois, the Good Governance organization, raised money so that this initiative can actually happen last year. We're hoping that this initiative can continue every 10 years and not just 10 years, like not just at the city level, at the state and other levels too, because people have never seen an alternative. And so when they haven't seen an alternative, they can't really imagine what an alternative process could look like. And to me, I think if you start from residents, because residents actually know their community the best, they should dictate to the elected official how their district should be drawn for 10 years. It's not like it's just been drawn for 1 year and then like, okay, we'll do this process again. It's drawn 10 years. That's a long time. And if your resources get kind of locked up or your priorities are not matched with the elected official, then you're kind of stuck in these like scenarios where you're just trying to like go with the flow for like 10 years and then you do the next census and hopefully you'll get a count that's accurately representing the count that your community deserves. Like that is a whole process. And so you want to make sure that like if we are able to influence as much as possible this process so that in the future it won't actually change for the worse. That's why we're also trying to introduce legislation at the state level to like ensure that there are independent bodies that can actually oversee these very important processes, so that it's not just like completely drawn without any input from the public or any even transparency for that matter. So I'm really hoping that like opportunities like this can help people like rethink this important process, that it actually should be in the hands of people and not just in the hands of people who already have power and money and influence.
So to close out, will you let all these nice people know how they can make their voices heard and maybe some important dates they should keep in mind?
Yes, so some of the important dates include the June 28th primary election. So this is a gubernatorial election that's happening at the state level. So that means the governor, your state representatives are up for election. And the primaries are actually typically elections where people tend to not vote because they maybe not see that there's any actual influence on it. But there is, because that's going to dictate what's actually happening in the primary election, the general election later this year. But there's a very important question that probably will be on the ballot, which is the two maps. So the Latino caucus map, which is the People's Coalition map, is what it's called, and the Rules Committee or Black Caucus-led map. And those two maps right now are up for potentially referendum questions, and if people don't show up, then the people who do show up will dictate what happens to the wards and those lines for the next 10 years. And those lines will basically take effect in 2023, and so that will influence and impact the elections that will happen. So be on the lookout for that.
Put it in your calendar right now.
June election.
June 28th.
Yep.
But you can early vote, right?
Yes, there's going to be early voting. There's also the mayoral election that's going to happen in the winter of the following year. So, one, if you're interested in running for any office, I think now is your time to start thinking about that and potentially put your name on the ballot for next year. What else? I mean, that election is going to be very dramatic, and you just got to keep your eye on it. So, there you go.
June 28th.
Put it in your calendar.
Put it in your calendar. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Give us money if you can. And if you don't know who your alderman is, send him an email and say hello.
That's right.
Oh, he doesn't say hi back.